Whether Pokrovsk falls, it matters not from a tactical perspective for the Ukrainians. The conventional military tactics book has been ripped up, is being rewritten. The losses on the Russians have been huge. Russia is not going to win on the front line. While Russia claims it's taken 2 Ukrainian cities, the battlefield is telling a different story. I'm Philip Ingram, and this is Battle Plans Exposed. Clashes on the front line are intensifying. Chaos on the diplomatic front and pressure on a peace deal is mounting. The situation was looking bleak for Ukraine. But yet again, Ukraine has shown incredible resilience, resolve and ingenuity to not only fend off Russian advance, but to counter it. In today's episode, we'll look at the reality on the front line. Is Russia winning, or is it all a ruse? So let's have a look at some clips from the front line. Surprise attacks on Putin's shadow fleet. Kero and Virat tankers were critically hit just off Turkey by Ukraine SBU Sea Baby naval drones while en route to Novopavlivka, carrying an estimated $70 million worth of oil each. Now, Ukraine is taking its fight even further, according to reports, and this is a Russian shadow fleet tanker off the coast of Senegal. It reported external explosions before water coming in and stopping it from achieving any power and starting to sink down to the stern. The Ukrainians have not, interestingly, claimed responsibility for this yet, but it seems as if Ukrainian intelligence is taking the war on a global basis. So near occupied Kupyansk, Ukraine's military intelligence blew up a group of the Kadrovites, which are a Chechen-based Russian defense force, during a fuel deal. A lot of dodgy deals with military fuel happening in different areas. The strike targeted in the middle of an exchange. Whether this was a legitimate exchange or part of the corruption that's going on the front line, it's hard to tell. But the SBU and the HUR know exactly where to target. The Russians aren't safe anywhere. So this is the first time that we've seen a Russian Shahid drone with a guided air-to-air missile, the R-60. However, this drone didn't survive. It was shot down using a Sting drone, a Ukrainian anti-drone drone, many of which are going to be manufactured in the United Kingdom to knock it out of the sky. But the Shahid drones now have a capability to launch air-launched air-to-air missiles. This is something that will change Ukraine's tactics when it comes to dealing with the threat from a fixed wing perspective. So the world's deadliest weapon fails again. This is the 5th failure on launch of Russia's Satan II missile, and that has fallen back to earth. It seems to be, for the world's deadliest weapon, it's only the launch crew that are going to suffer. So let's take a closer look at the front line. In the war that has lasted more than 3.5 years, the heaviest fighting over the past 2 months has been centred in Pokrovsk. And here we have Pokrovsk, Myrnohrad and Rodynske, the cauldron that is closing in and around and stopping the Ukrainians getting in and out. So starting with Pokrovsk, what's going on? Well, in Pokrovsk itself, the Russians have claimed that they've taken the whole of the city. They haven't. The Ukrainians are still active within the city and active in major parts of the city. In Myrnohrad, the Ukrainians have control of most of the town. It is a smaller area than Pokrovsk, but the Russians are pushing into it. Here, the Russians have probably got 55%, 60%. Here, the Russians have got 15, 20%, if that. And then up in Rodynske, we're seeing the activity from the Russians as they try to close the areas of this cauldron. At some stage, the Ukrainians are going to make the decision to withdraw from Pokrovsk. And therefore, once they do that, the Russians have the ability to close this cauldron, and they're going to order the withdrawal from Myrnohrad, even though the Russians are not threatening that militarily at the moment. But they need to get the troops out in good order. Pokrovsk will fall. But whether Pokrovsk falls or whether Pokrovsk has fallen, it matters not from a tactical perspective for the Ukrainians. They have caused massive effect on the Russians by creating tens of thousands of casualties. Pokrovsk was once important because of the road network and the rail network that the Ukrainians relied on for supplies. They haven't moved any logistics through this route for at least 5 or 6 months because of Russian drones and Russian artillery attacks in the area. So from a tactical military perspective, it is not important to Ukraine anymore. For the Russians, they will say this victory over Pokrovsk is a huge victory and shows that they're advancing through the Donbass. Ukraine will fall back to further defensive positions, ready to fix the Russians once again for another 12, 18 or 24 months, as they did with Mariupol, with Bakhmut, with Pokrovsk, and the next town or city we'll see. So the Russians, as they fight in through Pokrovsk, they've got effectively 2 combined arms armies fighting in here. But both of those armies have, in military terms, culminated. They're exhausted. They're not in a position to be able to exploit whenever Pokrovsk is captured, or exploit the capture of Pokrovsk. They won't be able to then go further forward. They need time to refurbish. They need time to get new personnel in, and that will take weeks or months before they're ready for anything else. The losses on the Russians have been huge. President Zelensky has just said in his recent speeches that the Pokrovsk and the fighting in the east is not about preserving territory. It's about causing attrition to the Russians. The Russians so far have lost about 1.2, 1.3 million casualties. In the last year alone, 1/3 of a million casualties at least have been in this sort of area. And what have they achieved? Houses that are rubble, something that is not strategically, operationally, or tactically significant anymore. It'll allow Putin to put a few tweets out on X and out on other social media platforms to declare a victory. Does that affect the speed that he's going to prosecute this war? Does it affect Ukraine's ability to continue its defense? No. The other thing we have to remember about this area, and it's exemplified by what's going on in Rodynske, we're seeing small groups, 3 to 5 men, moving forward and putting flags in different buildings or saying they've captured something. They haven't captured it, they get pushed back very quickly indeed. But this is indicative of the tactics that we're seeing across the front line here and the way we should describe the front line. There are little pockets of 3 to 5 men of the Russians inside Ukrainian held territory. There are little pockets of 3 to 5 Ukrainian men inside Russian held territory. It doesn't mean that you control or you own that territory. It shows that this front line is not a linear single line on a map, but is a much wider area. That area is dictated by drone coverage, by artillery coverage, by mortar coverage, by where men can get on foot or bicycle or a motorbike without being detected. But often when they're detected, they then disappear and nobody knows anything about it. It's a very, very fluid front line, and that is why over the weeks and months, it's difficult to say who has got what. And this is why the information domain is so important, and Russia can exploit that by putting a flag here, by saying they've pushed something else out there, by saying they've captured another building here. But it doesn't mean that they're having the victory that they're suggesting it is. So, these small groups, what do they signify, and what are they saying about the battlefield? Well, what they're saying is that the Russians can't maneuver with their vehicles. The drone threat, the artillery threat is such that vehicles will get destroyed. Armoured vehicles are used as taxis to get infantry as far forward as possible, and then it's small groups on foot that are going out to carry out the effect. The same is almost the way for the Ukrainians. But the Ukrainians have got an advantage here. Using armour in defence is something that means they're not having to manoeuvre their armoured forces in the same sort of way. And they can use the likes of the British supplied Challenger 2 tanks as a sniper tank. And it's something that the Ukrainians say it's perfectly designed for. So the conventional military tactics book has been ripped up and is being rewritten. We have positional defences from the Ukrainians. The Russians are optimised for positional defences, which is why they're not exploiting their attacks very well. The thinking behind the Russian tactics, whenever they advance into an area, have got nothing behind them to be able to push through and continue that momentum. Momentum is lacking. What does this mean for the way that fights are going to happen in the future, or potentially elsewhere in the front line? It's going to be more of the same. neither side can generate sufficient combat power to have a decisive victory on the front line. Russia could win on the front line if Ukraine collapsed or Ukraine was ordered to move back. But Ukraine is holding them and has held them for the last 4 years. Now, in that 4 years, if we compare it to the Second World War, Russia has advanced about 40 kilometers. In the Second World War, Russia pushed the Germans back from just outside Moscow to just outside Berlin. And the casualties, Second World War, 8 to 10 million casualties. Here, we're about 1.3 million casualties. But that's significantly more, and that's just on the Russian side. That's significantly more than the Allies suffered in battles in the Second World War. Russia is not going to win on the front line, which is why Vladimir Putin is using any little victory that he can claim in the information domain to try and influence what's going on politically and with the negotiations over peace agreements. So looking at what's going to happen next, let's look out to the wider picture. So next, it's difficult to assess. As I said, the Russians, the two combined arms armies that are fighting in and around Pokrovsk will have culminated. That means that they can't generate sufficient combat power to do anything else. Their troops are exhausted, their equipment's exhausted, their commanders are exhausted. So Russia could look at other areas. Novopavlivka, Stepnorysk in Zaporizhzhia. There's already indications to suggest build-up of troops in this area, and they might try and open another front into there. The Russians might decide to try and continue with other combined arms armies and other troops in the Donetsk region. But the area of Donetsk that they don't hold is huge. British military intelligence, the defence intelligence, has assessed it will take the Russians at least another 4 years and at least another 2 million casualties to capture that. That is why we're seeing the Russians trying to get that included as part of any peace agreement so they can get it for free. Ukraine has got a number of defensive lines through there where they can fix the Russians again for that at least 4 years and create at least 2 million more casualties. Can the Russians survive that? The other area that the Russians are looking at is up around Kupyansk. In this area, they might try and push a new front out towards Kharkiv, something that they have been wanting to take back again ever since the Ukrainians recaptured it. But then again, Vladimir Putin is throwing a spanner in the works. He's talked about another buffer zone between Russia and Ukraine, and especially up around the Sumy area. And there might be a move of troops potentially to attack into Ukraine here to create another buffer. However, from a troop movement perspective, we've seen Russian troops just across the Russian border in this region being moved back around to the east. So if anything is going to happen in the short to medium term after Pokrovsk is taken, it will either be in the Zaporizhzhia region, Kupyansk region, and at an outside guess, possibly further movements into Donetsk Oblast. So those are the Russian options. What is Ukraine likely to do? Well, Ukraine's in a better position here. It's defending, and it's got pre-prepared defences all along this front line. This front line is huge. Think of Aberdeen to London. That is 1,000 kilometres, 700 odd miles. It depends on where you measure your wiggly line as you go through, but it's huge. Ukraine has changed its tactics, as we've explained in other episodes, and is moving away from a positional defence to having a more core structure, but it's not quite got that right yet. So we'll see Ukraine continuing its positional defences, but again, focused on towns and cities. Russia has got this fixation with them, as we saw with Mariupol, as we saw with Bakhmut, as we saw with Pokrovsk. Russia likes to throw everything at getting a town or city. Ukraine will have noticed that and will have pre-prepared its defences. It has pre-prepared its defences at other towns and cities. And if it can fix Russia there, then that's what President Zelensky says is winning for them on the front line, because they're using that time then to carry out those attacks against the shadow fleet as we've seen, attacks against oil and gas infrastructure across Russia, closing down Russian airspace, closing down and bringing the fight to the Russian people so it becomes more visible to them, with the aim of, in a few years' time, as Putin is looking to the West to get Ukraine fatigue, the Russian people looking to Vladimir Putin and getting war fatigue. And that's the one thing that Putin fears most. So what's happening next and what's going on? The one thing I can be certain of is this war will still be going on through 2026. Whether it is under the auspices of some form of peace agreement and trying to implement that, possible, but the Russians will, or the Russians have rejected the current peace agreement. Whether the fighting's at the intensity that we've seen through this year, it's distinctly possible it could get stronger. But as ever, Battle Plans Exposed will be here to keep you up to date with what's happening here, but also what's happening in the rest of the world, because we have to remember that whilst Ukraine is ongoing, the Americans are preparing around Venezuela, the Chinese are increasing the tension in Southeast Asia, Japan is responding to that, and the Middle East hasn't gone away. This is Battle Plans Exposed. I'm Philip Ingram. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, put your comments in, ask us what you want to hear about next, but thank you for watching. Goodbye.